Buckle up, listeners, because today we're on a wild ride, folks. We're diving deep into the wild 2 billion-year history of sex.
Yeah, from ancient microbes swapping genes to, well, let's just say us, you know.
And our guide for this mind-blowing adventure, oh boy, it's a wild one, is David Baker's book. Hold on, I've got the title right here. NUW, The Shortest History of Sex, 2 Billion Years of. It's quite the story.
Yeah, you'd think something as, essential as sex would be pretty straightforward, but the more you learn about its origins, the weirder it gets, believe me.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Why sex at all?
That's a question that's been stumping biologists for, forever. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, just cloning yourself seems way more efficient, right?
Yeah, totally. No need to find a mate, no risk of STDs, just boom, instant offspring.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Baker thinks the answer might be a global catastrophe.
Yeah.
So massive, so huge, it makes an ice age look like a walk in the park.
A global catastrophe. Okay, now you've got my attention. Hit me with it.
Okay, imagine this. 2 billion years ago, our planet, completely encased in ice, right? Snowball Earth. Oceans frozen solid. Temperatures plummeting. And life on Earth just barely hanging on.
Dude, talk about a hostile environment. So how did this icy apocalypse lead to, Make's vague gesture, sex?
Well, put yourself in the shoes, I guess, of a microbe. Just a single cell in this frozen wasteland. Resources, super scarce, the environment's changing constantly, and the competition, man, it's fierce.
Sounds stressful.
It was. And according to Baker, this is where sex comes in. This intense pressure of snowball Earth, it created the perfect conditions for sex to evolve as a survival mechanism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does swapping genes with another microbe help you survive a global freeze?
Think about it like this. If you're constantly just cloning yourself, your offspring are basically identical copies, same strengths, same weaknesses. Works great in a stable environment, but in the chaos of snowball Earth, adaptability, that was key.
Oh, okay, I see. So by mixing genes with another microbe, you're shuffling the deck, you're increasing the chances that at least some of your offspring have the traits they need to survive whatever crazy stuff the environment throws at them.
Exactly. Sex brought in genetic variation, making it way more likely that at least some offspring, would be equipped to deal with, extreme cold, food shortages, you name it.
Wow. So a planet covered in ice might be the reason, well, all of us are here today. That's mind-blowing. But hold on. If sex is so great for survival, why isn't everything doing it?
That's a great question. It's just that, sex has its downsides too. It's messy, it's inefficient.
And let's be honest, it can be a little awkward.
Yeah, exactly. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes you more vulnerable, to predators. When you're busy trying to find a mate, you're not really paying attention to what's going on around you.
Makes you an easy target.
You got it.
Wow. So for some species, the risks of sex, they just decided it's not worth it and they stuck with the whole, asexual reproduction thing.
Yeah, precisely.
Man, it's just wild to think that something as fundamental to our existence as sex came from such a crazy, unpredictable time on Earth.
Absolutely. And we're just getting started. As we move from those microbes to our fishy ancestors, things get even wilder, trust me.
Fish sex. All right, now you're speaking my language. I've always wondered how that works in the water.
Oh man, get ready to have your mind blown because fish sex, let me tell you, it's about as far from a romantic candlelit dinner as you can get.
All right, lay it on me.
So, us land dwellers, right? We've got this whole elaborate process of internal fertilization. Well, early fish, they didn't bother with any of that.
Wait, so no, makes awkward gesture, actual contact.
Nope, no contact necessary.
Yeah.
Early fish, they reproduce through this thing called external fertilization. Females would just release their eggs into the water, and the males would swim by and release their sperm. Imagine a giant underwater sperm bank.
Whoa, just releasing eggs and sperm into the open ocean? That seems, risky. Talk about taking your chances.
Right. But it worked for them. Remember, we're talking hundreds of millions of years ago. Life in the ocean, it was all about quantity over quality.
Survival of the, most numerous sperm?
Pretty much. But as fish, evolved, started venturing into shallower waters and eventually onto land, things had to change. They got a bit more complex. Baker talks about how some fish develop these things called claspers.
Claspers? Okay, I'll bite. What in the world are claspers?
Think of them like proto-penises, like small appendages that helped males direct their sperm closer to the female's eggs. It's a step towards internal fertilization, but not quite there yet.
So we're going from like squirting gametes into the vast ocean to at least having some sort of, I don't know, direction. That's progress, I guess.
It is, and this transition from external to internal fertilization, this is a big deal in the evolution of sex because it leads to the development of, well, the penis as we know it.
And this is where things get really wild. According to Baker, the first penises were actually inside out.
You read that right. Early reptiles, they had these proto-penises that were housed inside their bodies. They would only, pop out during the act.
Hold on. They had a penis, but it was tucked away inside. How does that even, work?
It's kind of hard to picture, right? Imagine both sexes having what looks like a vagina, but then, boom, a penis emerges from one of them when it's time to mate.
That's both, incredible and terrifying at the same time. Why on earth would they evolve that way?
Well, there are a few theories floating around. One possibility is that internal penises were, just a transitional stage, like a stepping stone on the way to the external penises we see today in mammals.
So kind of like a beta version of the penis?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Another idea is that it, offered some protection, keeping the penis tucked away safely inside the body when it wasn't in use. Remember, this was a time when reptiles were, diversifying like crazy. Competition for resources, including mates, was fierce.
It's a jungle out there. Or, well, it was a jungle back then.
But perhaps the most interesting theory is that an internal penis might have actually given males a competitive advantage.
A competitive advantage? How so? I don't quite see it.
Think about it this way. If a female's looking for a mate, an internal penis might have made it harder for her to, assess a male's, shall we say, qualifications before choosing to mate.
So no quick visual inspection. It adds an element of surprise.
Exactly. This lack of immediate visual assessment could have leveled the playing field, giving males with less impressive attributes a chance to, pass on their genes.
So the evolution of the penis is about protection, strategic reveal, and maybe a little bit of deception. Who knew?
It's a fascinating example of how evolution can lead to such, unexpected and kind of counterintuitive adaptations. And this story continues to unfold as we move from reptiles to our early mammalian ancestors. Those tiny, rodent-like creatures that were running around in the shadow of the dinosaurs.
The ones who eventually led to us.
Yes. They're the ones who finally ditched that whole inside-out penis thing and went for the external model we're more familiar with today.
I have to admit, I'm a little relieved to hear that. But what prompted this major redesign? What was the evolutionary advantage of an external penis?
Well, Baker suggests that it might have been all about female choice.
Female choice? You mean females started picking mates based on their equipment?
Precisely. With an external penis, females could finally, get a good look at what they were dealing with. They could assess a male's health, his size, and maybe even his potential for performance.
Talk about upping your game. So females were calling the shots. I like it.
It seems that way. And this shift towards female choice might have also played a role in the evolution of another fascinating feature, the clitoris.
Ooh la la. Tell me everything about the clitoris.
Well, in early mammals, the clitoris was basically a miniature version of the penis. Same structure, same developmental origins. But as mammals evolved and females gained more influence over mate choice, the clitoris kind of took on a life of its own.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of just being a small nub on the outside,
Yeah.
the clitoris grew internally, developing this complex network of nerve endings that are super sensitive to touch. In fact, the clitoris has, get this, 2 to 3 times as many nerve endings as the penis.
Wow, it's not just a miniature version anymore. It's like a super-powered pleasure center.
Exactly. And this suggests that female sexual pleasure became increasingly important in the evolution of sex. Think about it. If females are choosing their mates, they're more likely to go for the males who can provide them with a good time.
Right. Why settle for anything less? But hold on. If female pleasure is so important, why did it take so long to evolve? What's the evolutionary advantage there?
Well, remember, for most of evolutionary history, sex was primarily about reproduction, not necessarily about pleasure. But as mammals evolved larger brains and more complex social structures, things started to shift.
So bigger brains, more complex societies. How did that change the game for sex?
It's all about the evolution of monogamy. As our early human ancestors started developing larger brains, their babies were born increasingly helpless, requiring years of parental care to survive.
Right, unlike those fish just squirting out eggs and hoping for the best.
Exactly. This shift toward helpless babies and extended parental care, it created the need for strong pair bonds between males and females. In other words, monogamy.
So monogamy, the ultimate game changer, emerged. Interesting. But wait, I thought you said humans are primates, right? And primates are known for being, well, a bit promiscuous.
That's right. And here's where things get really, really fascinating. We humans were caught in this evolutionary tug of war between our, ancient promiscuous programming and our more recently evolved monogamous tendencies.
So we're hardwired for both monogamy, A and D, a little bit of monkey business on the side. No wonder relationships are so complicated.
You could say that. And this tension between our, primal urges and our societal norms, it continues to shape our desires, our relationships, and even our views on sex, even today.
This is getting juicy. So, from squirting gametes in the ocean to the rise of monogamy and the evolution of female pleasure, it's been a wild ride. But we're not done yet, are we? Where are we head next on this journey through the history of sex?
We're about to see how the rise of agriculture about 12,000 years ago, brought about these huge changes, not just in how we live, but also in our relationship with sex and society itself. It's a story of property, patriarchy, and this constant conflict between our primal instincts and our ever-evolving cultures.
Okay, so we're going from the wild world of prehistoric sex to the dawn of civilization. This is getting good. Let's dive in.
Yeah, so when we talk about the emergence of agriculture, we're not just talking about a change in, our diet. It was like this huge fundamental shift in human social structures.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, came a whole new way of looking at sex.
Right, that makes sense. You go from this nomadic lifestyle, always on the move, to settling down in one place, cultivating crops, building a home, putting down roots.
Exactly. Suddenly you've got something to lose.
Yeah.
And that's where things get, well, kind of interesting from a sexual perspective.
Okay, how so?
Well, with settled agriculture, you start to see the emergence of property, right? Land, livestock, tools. And with that comes a whole new set of anxieties, especially around inheritance.
Oh, I see. You want to make sure that all your stuff, your hard-earned property, goes to your kids, your direct descendants, not, someone else's.
Exactly. And this is where paternity becomes, really important, right? Societies needed ways to be sure about the lineage of their children.
Yeah.
And that led to, well, a more controlled approach to sexuality, you could say.
So how did this focus on paternity, how did that actually play out, in terms of societal norms and expectations?
Well, mostly, if we're being honest, infected women.
How so?
Remember how we talked about female choice being such a big deal in shaping sexuality earlier on?
Right.
Like with the clitoris?
Yeah, definitely a win for female pleasure.
Totally. But with the rise of agriculture and, patriarchy, things start moving in the opposite direction. Women's sexuality, especially their ability to have children, it becomes closely tied to inheritance and property rights.
Because they're the ones who give birth. Right. So, controlling their sexuality means controlling the lineage.
Yeah.
And that means controlling the inheritance.
Precisely. Baker points to this shift, by looking at things like the emergence of these concepts of female virginity, chastity belts, and, a whole bunch of laws and punishments designed to, control women's bodies and their choices.
Wow. So the rise of agriculture, it was kind of a double-edged sword in a way.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have settlements, civilizations, all that. But on the other hand, it's also about greater control over women's sexuality.
It's a complicated and honestly often pretty troubling chapter in human history. And this back and forth between biology and culture, it still resonates even today. Think about it. How many cultures still place a ton of importance on a woman's virginity? You know what I mean?
It's kind of amazing, actually, when you think about it, how these ancient anxieties around inheritance are still around today in some form or another. But what about the men? Were there similar restrictions placed on them?
It's not really the same. Men weren't subjected to the same level of scrutiny and control as women. But the concept of paternity definitely had implications for their behavior too.
Oh, okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, you see this growing emphasis on fidelity, being faithful, at least for women. Men, on the other hand, they often had a bit more leeway in some cultures, particularly those with more wealth and power. Think about the concept of polygamy, specifically polygyny, where one man has multiple wives.
Right. That seems like a pretty sweet deal for the guy in charge. But wasn't that already happening before agriculture, though? Didn't we talk about how some primates, they have multiple mates?
You're absolutely right. Polygyny was definitely a thing before agriculture. And it continued in some cultures, even after. But Baker argues that, with agriculture and these new ideas about individual property rights, polygyny started to, decline a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you're like splitting up your land and your wealth among a bunch of different heirs, things could get complicated real quick.
Exactly. Monogamy, with its emphasis on those strong pair bonds and, both parents raising the kids together, it became the dominant model in many agricultural societies anyway, especially in those with these more, top-down hierarchical structures.
So it's all about keeping those bloodlines pure and making sure that wealth and property are transferred smoothly from one generation to the next.
You got it. And this shift towards monogamy, man, it had a huge impact on how we, even today, view love, relationships, sexuality, all of it.
Fascinating. So we've gone from these microbes swapping genes in this frozen wasteland to fish doing their thing in the ocean, and now we're talking about agriculture, patriarchy, and this whole complex web of sex, property, and control. Man, it's a lot to wrap my head around.
It is, but it shows just how incredibly diverse and adaptable sex is.
It really does.
And we're not even done yet. As we move into the next phase of our journey, we're going to explore how these attitudes towards sex, how they continue to change through time. We'll touch on everything from the emergence of sex work and pornography to the ways different cultures view same-sex relationships.
Oh boy, things are about to get juicy. Don't go anywhere, folks, because we're diving even deeper into the fascinating history of sex right after this. All right, we're back, folks. So last we left off, we were talking about the rise of agriculture, the dawn of civilization, and all the ways it, kind of shaped how we think about sex. And it sounded like things were getting, well, little, let's just say, buttoned up.
Yeah, in a way, I guess. You're right. The whole emphasis on, property and passing things down, it brought about all these anxieties and, as we said, stricter controls, especially when it came to women's sexuality.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, all doom and gloom. Even with all those rigid rules, human desire, well, it always finds a way.
Okay, now we're talking. So how did people, get around all those restrictions? Give me the juicy details.
Well, one way was through the development of what Baker calls these shadow markets. These were spaces where, let's just say, the rules were a little more flexible, where pleasure could be, sought out, often for a price.
So basically the world's oldest profession.
Exactly. Sex work, it became pretty common in a lot of these agrarian societies. It provided, income for the people involved, and it was an outlet for those looking for sexual gratification outside of, the whole marriage and societal expectations thing.
It's fascinating how even back then, thousands of years ago, people were finding ways to express their desires and figure out this whole messy world of sex and relationships.
It really shows you how powerful human sexuality really is. And it wasn't just sex work either. Baker also talks about the emergence of pornography. It took different forms, from ancient erotic art to written stories, and it just highlights how much humans have always been fascinated by depictions of sex.
It makes you think, how much of what we do is driven by our biology versus the cultural norms we grew up with. Is there some sort of, fundamental human drive for sexual expression that exists, separate from all these societal rules?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Philosophers and scientists have been going back and forth on that one for ages, and there's no easy answer. But what's clear from Baker's book is that human sexuality, it's complicated. It's a mix of our evolutionary history, our biology, and of course, the ever-changing cultural landscape we live in.
And speaking of changing landscapes, let's fast forward a bit. What about the modern era? How did things like, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of feminism change how we view sex?
That's when things really start to shift. The Industrial Revolution, for all its progress and all, it also brought about this huge social upheaval. People were moving from rural areas to the big city. Traditional family structures were being challenged, and there was this growing sense of individual autonomy, especially among women.
So it's all the old rules were being thrown out, but there weren't really any new ones yet?
Exactly. And right smack in the middle of all this chaos comes this game changer, the pill.
Ah, yes. The little tablet that revolutionized, well, everything. Sex, relationships, you name it. Suddenly, women had real control over their bodies and their reproductive choices for the first time, really.
Exactly. It was a pivotal moment. Combined with, the growing feminist movement, the pill ushered in what we now call the sexual revolution, a time of huge change in how we thought about sex, gender roles, personal freedom, all of it.
It's actually kind of hard to imagine a world without, readily available contraception. It wasn't that long ago that women just didn't have that kind of agency over their bodies. Makes you appreciate how far we've come.
For sure. And Baker, to his credit, He explores both the good and the, let's say, challenging aspects of this newfound freedom.
Okay, like what?
Well, on the one hand, it led to more equality between men and women, more sexual liberation, and this wider acceptance of, all kinds of different sexualities. But on the flip side, it also brought new anxieties, particularly around, relationships and family structures.
It's like that old saying, right? With great freedom comes great responsibility.
Exactly. The decline of traditional courtship, the rise in divorce, the emergence of open relationships and polyamory, these were all part of this massive shift that happened in the late 20th century.
And here we are in the 21st century still trying to figure out what it all means. It's almost impossible to predict where things are going next.
You're telling me. Baker ends his book by, throwing out some ideas about the potential futures of sex and relationships. He talks about how technology is changing things, online dating, virtual reality sex, even the possibility of, genetic engineering to reshape how we think about reproduction altogether.
Whoa. It's like we're on the verge of a whole new frontier when it comes to sex and intimacy. It's a little daunting, but kind of exciting too.
It is, and I think that's a great place to leave things, Our deep dive into this 2 billion year history of sex, it's shown us just how complex, how fascinating, and how constantly evolving human sexuality truly is. From those ancient microbes swapping genes in a frozen world to, today's debates about Tinder and reproductive technologies. It's a story of adaptation, desire, and this constant push and pull between our biology and our culture.
Beautifully said. It's been an incredible journey. And I don't know about you, but my mind is officially blown. So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. As we head into this strange new world of sex and relationships, what will your story be? How will you navigate all the complexities of desire, intimacy, and connection in the 21st century? We'd love to hear your thoughts.